The wind howled through the towering glass panes of the Golden Crescent Hotel's entrance, as rain hammered against the building, the storm outside casting a chilling shadow over the grand lobby. Big Shaq stepped in, droplets of water trailing behind him, his hoodie pulled tight over his head. He glanced around, taking in the gilded chandeliers and polished marble floor that gleamed with unnatural perfection. He adjusted his hood slightly, his casual attire a sharp contrast to the opulent setting. At the reception desk, a woman with sharp features and an even sharper tongue was busy typing on her computer. Her name tag read, Ms. Crowley. Her pristine uniform and stiff posture matched the air of superiority she exuded. Shaq approached the desk with a warm, casual smile. Good evening. I've got a reservation under the name Shaquille O'Neal, he said in his deep, calm voice, sliding an ID card across the counter. Ms. Crowley glanced at him briefly, her lips curling into a sneer. We're fully booked for the night, she said flatly, not bothering to check her system. Her gaze lingered on his hoodie and jeans. And frankly, I don't think this is the kind of establishment you're looking for. Shaq raised an eyebrow, unfazed. That's strange. I booked a week ago. Maybe you can double-check? She sighed dramatically, tapping a few keys with exaggerated reluctance. There's nothing under that name. Like I said, we're fully booked. Her tone was laced with condescension, her disdain barely concealed. A few other guests in the lobby turned to watch the interaction, their curiosity piqued. Some exchanged glances, but no one intervened. Shaq remained composed, his smile fading slightly as he took in her dismissive attitude. I see, he said simply, his voice steady. Well, is there a manager I can speak to? Ms. Crowley folded her arms. The manager doesn't have time for complaints about non-existent bookings. You're welcome to try your luck at one of the motels down the road. She gestured vaguely toward the storm raging outside. For a moment, Shaq said nothing, his towering frame still and silent. Then he gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. All right. Thank you. He turned away, leaving Ms. Crowley to her smug satisfaction. As he walked deeper into the lobby, he took note of the faint flickering of the overhead lights. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, a bone-chilling cold seeping into the air. He paused near a grand staircase, feeling an inexplicable sense of unease. He wasn't the only one. A young couple huddled together near the fireplace, whispering about how their room felt. Wrong. A bellboy rushed past, his face pale, muttering about seeing something strange in the hallway mirrors. Shaq's gaze shifted back to Ms. Crowley, who continued to type away at her computer, oblivious to the growing tension around her. Her dismissive attitude had been insulting, but it wasn't his main concern. Something about the hotel felt off. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, though every time he turned, there was nothing there. He decided to walk around the lobby, observing the ornate decor and the subtle cracks beneath its perfection. A portrait hung above the grand fireplace, depicting a man in old-fashioned attire with a stern expression. Shaq frowned as he noticed the man's eyes seemed to follow him no matter where he stood. Creepy, right? A voice said softly beside him. Shaq turned to see an older gentleman in a well-tailored suit, his silver hair neatly combed back. Name's Harold, the man said, extending a hand. Been coming here for years. But lately this place. It's changed. Shaq shook his hand, his grip firm. Changed how? Harold glanced around nervously, lowering his voice. Strange things. People disappearing. Staff quitting without notice. And that storm? It wasn't even in the forecast. Shaq nodded thoughtfully. Appreciate the heads up. Harold gave him a wary look. You seem like someone who can handle themselves. Just be careful. As Harold walked away, Shaq's focus returned to the receptionist. He watched as Miss Crowley dealt with another guest, her condescending tone unchanged. But as she handed over a room key, the lights flickered again, this time plunging the lobby into momentary darkness. When the lights came back on, Shaq noticed something chilling. The portrait above the fireplace had changed. The man's stern expression was now a wide, unsettling grin. The tension in the Golden Crescent Hotel grew palpable as night fell. Guests began murmuring amongst themselves, uneasy after the power flicker and the brief blackout. Big Shaq moved purposefully through the lobby, taking in the undercurrents of fear that seemed to ripple through the space. He wasn't the type to spook easily, but even he felt a subtle, oppressive weight hanging in the air. Behind the desk, Ms. Crowley remained oblivious, continuing to dismiss complaints with the same haughty indifference. A middle-aged woman approached, explaining that her room door wouldn't open no matter how many times she tried the keycard. "Sounds like user error," Ms. Crowley said with a cold smile. "But I'll send someone to check when I can." "But," I said, "when I can," Ms. Crowley interrupted sharply, dismissing the woman with a wave of her hand. The woman, visibly shaken, glanced over at Shaq as if silently pleading for help. He offered her a reassuring nod, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the rising anxiety in the room. Shaq's instincts told him something was deeply wrong. He noticed a strange chill creeping along the floor, as though the storm outside had seeped into the building itself. The fireplace in the lounge was lit, yet it gave off no warmth. Guests sitting nearby had moved closer together, speaking in hushed tones about the eerie sensations they couldn't quite explain. As Shaq walked further into the hotel, he passed a bellboy standing rigidly near the elevators, his face pale. "Are you okay?" Shaq asked, his deep voice soft but commanding. The young man shook his head slightly, his eyes darting toward the mirrored elevator doors. I thought I saw someone behind me in the mirror," he stammered. "But when I turned around, there was no one there." Shaq's jaw tightened. "Take a break," he said. "Get some air if you need to." The bellboy nodded and hurried off, leaving Shaq to study the mirrors. The polished surfaces reflected the dimly lit lobby behind him, but as he stared, he thought he saw a faint movement, a shadow slipping past, just out of view. He turned quickly, but the space was empty. "Strange place," he muttered under his breath, stepping into the elevator. The ride up was unnervingly silent, the soft hum of the elevator motor seeming distant and distorted. The air inside felt heavier, colder, as if the space was closing in around him. When the doors slid open, the hallway before him was bathed in dim, flickering light. The corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with doors that seemed too close together, too uniform. Shaq walked forward, his footsteps echoing unnaturally. At the far end of the hallway, he noticed a door slightly ajar. Approaching cautiously, he pushed it open to find a vacant guest room. It was pristine, but something about it felt wrong. The air was stifling, and the bed, though perfectly made, seemed untouched, as though it was waiting for someone who would never arrive. On the bedside table lay a guest logbook. Shaq flipped through its pages, noting entries that abruptly stopped halfway down. The dates were recent, but the handwriting grew increasingly erratic as he neared the end. The final entry read, "The shadows watch. Don't look too long." The sound of faint laughter drifted in from the hallway, high-pitched and unsettling. Shaq turned quickly, stepping back into the corridor, but it was empty. The laughter faded as suddenly as it had come, replaced by a low, almost imperceptible hum. Downstairs, the guests' unease was escalating. A couple reported hearing whispers outside their room, but when they opened the door, no one was there. Another guest claimed to have seen a figure standing at the end of the hallway, only for it to vanish when approached. Ms. Crowley remained at her post, rolling her eyes at every complaint. "Honestly, people these days. So dramatic," she muttered under her breath. But her confidence wavered when the lights flickered again, this time staying off for several long seconds. In the darkness, there was a loud, unnatural creak, followed by a muffled scream from somewhere deep within the hotel. When the lights returned, Ms. Crowley's face had gone pale, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her blouse. Big Shaq returned to the lobby, his presence immediately commanding attention. He looked at Ms. Crowley, his expression unreadable. "You hear that?" he asked. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time that evening, she looked genuinely unsettled. The guests were now openly discussing leaving, but the storm outside made the idea impractical. The wind howled louder than before, and rain lashed against the glass with increasing ferocity. "Stay together," Shaq said to the crowd. "Whatever's happening, we'll figure it out. Just don't wander off alone." As he spoke, he felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just a storm, and these weren't ordinary events. Something was wrong with this place, and he couldn't ignore it. The hotel seemed to pulse around them, alive with a dark energy that was growing stronger by the minute. Shaq didn't know what lay ahead, but he was determined to face it. For now, the most important thing was keeping everyone safe, and uncovering the truth hidden within the Golden Crescent's walls. The storm outside reached a deafening crescendo, its howls reverberating through the walls of the Golden Crescent Hotel. Inside, the unease had turned to full-blown fear. Guests huddled together in small groups, their eyes darting to every flickering shadow. Even the staff, typically composed and professional, appeared shaken. Big Shaq remained calm but alert, moving through the lobby with purpose. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. He approached Harold, the older gentleman he'd spoken to earlier. Harold's hands were trembling as he gripped a cup of lukewarm coffee, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Harold," Shaq said, his voice steady. "What else do you know about this place?" Harold hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. "This hotel has a history," he admitted. "They don't talk about it, but I've heard stories. Strange things have happened here for decades. People disappearing, rooms that stay empty no matter how full the hotel is. And then there's the storm." "What about it?" "It's not natural," Harold said in a hushed tone. "Every time one of these storms hits, something bad happens. The locals call it a curse." Shaq's mind raced as he processed Harold's words. He glanced toward the front desk, where Miss Crowley sat stiffly, her usual air of superiority replaced by a thinly veiled anxiety. She clutched a phone in her hand, though it was clear from her expression that there was no signal. "Stay here," Shaq instructed Harold. He strode toward Miss Crowley, his imposing figure drawing her attention immediately. She straightened in her seat, attempting to regain her composure. "Do you have any records on this hotel's history?" Shaq asked, his tone firm but not unkind. Miss Crowley blinked, caught off guard. "Why would you need that?" "Because something's wrong here, and I don't think it started tonight," Shaq said. "If you know anything at all, you need to tell me." Her lips pressed together tightly, and for a moment, it seemed she wouldn't answer. But then the lights flickered again, and a low groan echoed through the building, as if the very walls were in pain. Miss Crowley's resolve crumbled. "There's an archive in the basement," she admitted reluctantly. "Old records, maintenance logs, stuff like that. But it's off limits to guests." "Not tonight, it's not," Shaq said, already moving toward the staff-only door at the back of the lobby. The basement was a stark contrast to the grandeur of the upper floors. The air was damp and heavy, and the narrow staircase leading down creaked ominously with every step. Shaq descended carefully, his flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness. At the bottom, he found a small room filled with filing cabinets and dusty shelves. The air smelled of mildew and neglect, but there was something else, a faint metallic tang that made his skin crawl. He sifted through the records, pulling out old blueprints, guest logs, and maintenance reports. One document caught his eye, a faded newspaper clipping dated nearly a century ago. The headline read, "Tragedy Strikes Golden Crescent Hotel. Entire wing sealed off after mysterious deaths." Shaq's eyes narrowed as he read further. The article described a series of unexplained incidents, culminating in the deaths of several staff members and guests. The west wing of the hotel had been sealed off, its doors bricked over, and its existence erased from official records. A shiver ran down his spine as he realized the truth. The Golden Crescent wasn't just cursed, it was haunted by the weight of its own dark history. Before he could delve deeper, a sudden crash echoed through the basement, followed by a chilling whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Shaq froze, his flashlight beam darting around the room. "Leave!" the voice hissed, low and menacing. But Shaq didn't back down. He stood his ground, his jaw set in determination. Not until I find out what's going on here, he said aloud. The air grew colder, and for a moment, he thought he saw a figure standing at the edge of the light, a shadowy silhouette that flickered like static before disappearing. Shaq returned to the lobby with the documents in hand. The guests and staff turned to him, their expressions a mix of hope and fear. "This place has a past," he began, his voice steady and commanding. "A past that's been buried. But whatever's happening now, it's tied to what happened back then." Harold nodded solemnly, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Ms. Crowley stepped forward hesitantly, her earlier arrogance completely gone. What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We stick together," Shaq said firmly. "And we figure this out. No one else disappears tonight." The room fell silent, but for the first time, there was a sense of unity among the group. They weren't just guests and staff anymore, they were survivors, bound by the shared terror of the unknown. Shaq knew the night was far from over. The storm outside raged on, and the shadows within the hotel seemed to grow darker with every passing minute. But he was determined to see it through, no matter what the Golden Crescent had in store. The tension in the hotel had reached a breaking point. Guests were barricading themselves in their rooms, and the staff huddled together in the kitchen, their confidence eroded by the strange phenomena plaguing the night. Shaq's commanding presence had become a lifeline, but even he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The storm outside showed no signs of abating, and the whispers in the hallways were growing louder, more insistent. As Shaq pieced through the evidence from the basement, he noticed a pattern in the guest logs and staff records. Certain dates stood out, nights when the hotel had been fully booked, only to have several guests mysteriously check out early or disappear altogether. The staff notes were cryptic but telling. Asterisk. Guest complaints about noise in the West Wing. No one assigned there. Asterisk. He turned to Ms. Crowley, who had reluctantly joined him in the manager's office. She was pale and visibly shaken, her usual air of authority completely eroded. "This isn't just a storm," Shaq said, laying the documents out before her. "These events, they're connected. Something is tied to that wing, something the hotel tried to bury." Ms. Crowley hesitated, her hands trembling as she picked up an old blueprint. "The West Wing," she said softly. "It was closed off decades ago. I've never even been inside. Management said it wasn't safe, that it wasn't worth the cost to renovate." But what?" Shaq pressed. She swallowed hard. "But we still hear things. The night staff reports footsteps, voices. Guests complain about figures in the halls. We write it off as superstition, but—" Shaq cut her off, his tone decisive. "It's not superstition. Something's happening here, and it's not stopping until we face it." He turned to the gathered group in the lobby, a mix of fearful guests and shell-shocked staff. "We need to get to the West Wing," he announced. "If we want to survive this, we have to confront whatever's behind it." A murmur of dissent rippled through the crowd. "Are you crazy?" a guest exclaimed. "You're talking about going toward the danger?" Shaq met the man's gaze, his expression unyielding. "You think staying here is safer? We've already seen what happens when we hide. This place feeds on fear and isolation. The only way out is through." Harold stepped forward, his face lined with resolve. "He's right. This isn't the first time the Crescent has seen trouble, but it might be the last if we don't act now." Reluctantly, the group began to organize. Shaq took charge, dividing them into smaller teams, one to gather supplies, another to monitor the exits, and a third to accompany him to the West Wing. Despite the fear thick in the air, a sense of purpose began to emerge. As they made their way through the dimly lit corridors, the atmosphere grew heavier. The air felt oppressive, charged with an almost tangible energy. The storm outside seemed to synchronize with their movements, each step accompanied by a flash of lightning or a distant roll of thunder. When they reached the bricked-over entrance to the West Wing, Shaq paused, studying the barrier. It was clear this wasn't a simple renovation, it was meant to keep something contained. "We're not turning back now," he said, grabbing a crowbar from the supplies they'd gathered. It took considerable effort, but the bricks began to give way. As the last chunk fell, a gust of icy air rushed out, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay. The group recoiled, but Shaq pressed forward, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The west wing was a stark contrast to the rest of the hotel. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the air was thick with dust and something more sinister, a presence that seemed to watch their every move. Shaq led the way, his steps confident but cautious. As they ventured deeper, they found signs of the past, abandoned luggage, crumbling furniture, and remnants of lives abruptly interrupted. But it wasn't until they reached the ballroom that the true horror revealed itself. The room was vast, its once grand chandeliers now reduced to skeletal frames. In the center stood a massive, ornate mirror, its surface tarnished and warped. Shaq felt a chill run down his spine as he approached it, the faint whispers growing louder with every step. "Don't look into it," Harold warned, his voice trembling. "That's what they say. The mirror shows you things you don't want to see." But Shaq wasn't one to back down. He stood before the mirror, his reflection barely recognizable in the distorted glass. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the surface rippled, and the whispers turned to screams. Images flashed before his eyes: the hotel's construction, the workers' struggles, and the greed of its original owner, a man who had built the Crescent on stolen land, exploiting both people and spirits. The ballroom had been the site of countless injustices, and the mirror had become a vessel for the rage and sorrow of those who had suffered. Shaq staggered back, his breathing heavy. "This is it," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "This is the source." The mirror began to pulse with an eerie light, the air around it crackling with energy. The group huddled together, their fear palpable. But Shaq stood firm, his resolve unshaken. He knew the only way to end this was to confront the hotel's dark legacy head-on. "We're not running," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Not this time." The ballroom fell into a deathly silence as Shaq's declaration echoed through the decayed walls. The mirror pulsed ominously, as if it had heard and understood his challenge. The group stood frozen, fear gripping them tightly, but Shaq didn't hesitate. He moved closer to the mirror, its warped surface reflecting not just his image, but the shadows of countless others, the victims, the oppressed, and the forgotten. "This isn't just a mirror," Shaq said firmly, addressing both the group and the unseen force within the room. "It's a prison. A reminder. And we've let it fester for too long." Harold, standing just behind him, whispered, "What are you planning to do? Break it?" Shaq shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "Breaking it might release whatever's inside. We need to find another way to end this, permanently." As the group began to discuss their next move, the whispers surged again, now clearer and more coherent. They carried fragments of accusations and pleas: thief, betrayer, justice, remember us. The voices were layered, chaotic, but they all shared one emotion: anguish. Ms. Crowley, who had been silent for most of the journey, suddenly stepped forward. "This isn't just a haunting. It's retribution. These spirits, they're tied to the hotel's past, and we're the ones keeping them here." Shaq turned to her, intrigued. "What do you mean?" She swallowed hard, her voice shaking. "The Crescent wasn't just built on stolen land. It was a place where people were used and discarded. Workers who died during construction, guests who were taken advantage of, employees who vanished after speaking out. It's all here. And the hotel never acknowledged any of it." Shaq nodded, understanding dawning on him. "So this isn't just about destruction. It's about accountability. Redemption." He looked back at the mirror, the faces within it now staring directly at him. It was as if they were waiting, demanding action. But what kind of action? How do you make amends for generations of suffering and injustice? Harold stepped forward, holding a stack of old guest ledgers and employee records they had found in the basement. "If this place thrives on secrets, then maybe exposing the truth is the key. We need to confront the hotel's history, bring it into the light." Shaq considered the idea. It made sense. The hotel's power came from its ability to hide its past, to bury the stories of those it had wronged. If they could break that cycle, perhaps they could weaken the hold of whatever entity controlled the Crescent. The group quickly got to work. Some searched for more records and artifacts, while others began documenting what they had found. They gathered photographs, letters, and logs, anything that told the stories of those who had suffered. As they worked, the oppressive atmosphere of the hotel seemed to shift. The air felt lighter, and the whispers, though still present, began to sound less angry and more sorrowful. But the mirror wasn't done. As they piled the evidence in the center of the ballroom, its surface began to ripple violently, the faces within contorting in agony. A low, guttural voice emerged, shaking the walls. Asterisk. You think this will end us? You cannot erase what has been done. Asterisk. Shaq stood tall, his voice calm but firm. We're not trying to erase it. We're acknowledging it. We're giving it the respect it deserves. The mirror let out a deafening screech, and the room began to shake. Cracks formed along the walls, and the chandeliers swayed dangerously. The group clung to each other, but Shaq didn't move. He stepped closer to the mirror, staring directly into its depths. I know you're angry, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. You have every right to be. But holding on to this pain, this rage, it's only keeping you trapped. It's time to let go. For a moment, everything stopped. The shaking ceased, the screeching faded, and the room fell silent once more. The mirror's surface rippled one last time, and then, slowly, the faces within it began to fade. As the final echoes of the voices disappeared, the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, each shard reflecting a different moment of the hotel's dark history. The group watched in awe as the shards dissolved into dust, leaving nothing but an empty frame behind. The air in the ballroom grew warm and still, and for the first time that night, the storm outside began to calm. The group exchanged looks of relief and exhaustion, but Shaq wasn't finished. This isn't over, he said, turning to Ms. Crowley and Harold. The Crescent story isn't just about what happened in the past. It's about what we do now. We can't let this place go back to what it was. Ms. Crowley nodded, determination lighting up her face. We'll rebuild it. Not just the building, but its legacy. This place will become a testament to the people who were here before us, a place of remembrance, not exploitation. As the group began to leave the ballroom, Shaq lingered for a moment, looking at the empty frame. He felt a sense of closure, but also a sense of responsibility. The Crescent story wasn't his alone to tell, but he had become a part of it, and he intended to see it through. With one final glance, he turned and followed the others, ready to face whatever came next. The group moved cautiously through the now silent hotel, their steps echoing through the hallways. The storm outside had finally subsided, but the sense of unease remained. The Crescent was no longer the suffocating, malevolent force it had been just hours before, but its legacy still lingered in the air. Shaq's mind raced as he processed everything they had uncovered, the hotel's dark history, the spirits bound within its walls, and the tragic souls seeking justice. As they gathered in the lobby, Shaq addressed the group. We've confronted the past. Now we need to make sure this place doesn't return to what it was. The hotel can be a force for good, but it'll only happen if we change its narrative. Ms. Crowley nodded, her voice steady despite the fatigue etched across her face. I agree. The history we uncovered, it's important. But we can't just leave it behind. We need to honor those who suffered here and use that pain to fuel something better. Harold, always the pragmatist, stepped forward. But what about the guests? Are we going to pretend nothing happened? They're still afraid. We can't just throw a coat of paint on the walls and call it a new beginning. Shaq glanced around the room at the frightened faces of the remaining guests, each of them holding on to the fragile hope that they were safe, that they had survived. We'll make sure they're heard, he said. We'll start with telling the truth. Let the world know what happened here, and give those who suffered a voice. The group fell into thoughtful silence, each person processing the enormity of their task. They had uncovered the truth, but it wasn't enough to simply expose the darkness. They had to transform it, turn it into something that would never again threaten the living or the dead. As Shaq and the others began to make plans, the hotel's energy began to shift once more. It wasn't the violent, oppressive force it had been, but there was a lingering tension, a reminder that some wounds couldn't be easily healed. Shaq took a deep breath, feeling the weight of leadership settle over him. He had come to the Crescent to investigate a strange situation, but he now found himself responsible for its future. There was no turning back. In the days that followed, the group worked tirelessly to expose the hotel's past, ensuring that every story, every injustice, was documented. They reached out to historians, journalists, and activists to help spread the word about the hotel's dark history, but also its potential for redemption. The media coverage was overwhelming, but it was the testimonies from survivors, the descendants of those who had suffered, that truly captured the public's attention. As word spread, people began to visit the Crescent not just for its luxury but to honor its past. They came to pay their respects to the victims, to learn the stories of those whose lives had been erased by greed and indifference. It wasn't easy. Many of the guests who came were hesitant, uncertain if they could truly forgive the hotel for its sins. But over time, the Crescent became a symbol of transformation, a place where the past was acknowledged, not ignored. Shaq, Ms. Crowley, and Harold worked together to create a memorial in the hotel, a permanent reminder of those who had been wronged. It was a small, humble space, but it spoke volumes. People who once feared the Crescent now saw it as a place of hope, a testament to the power of redemption and resilience. For Shaq, the journey wasn't just about uncovering the truth, it was about ensuring that history didn't repeat itself. He had witnessed firsthand the destructive power of discrimination and injustice, but he had also seen the strength of a community united in purpose. The Crescent was no longer just a hotel, it was a living testament to the power of growth and change. As he stood in front of the memorial, looking out over the hotel grounds, Shaq reflected on everything they had achieved. The hotel's history was now part of the world's consciousness, but more importantly, it was no longer an entity that could feed on the pain of the past. It had been transformed, both in its legacy and in the hearts of those who had fought for its redemption. He turned to Ms. Crowley, who stood beside him, a look of quiet pride on her face. "We did it," she said softly. "The Crescent is different now. It's not perfect, but it's better." Shaq nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "It's not about perfection. It's about making things right, about honoring those who were forgotten. We've done that." As the sun set over the Crescent, casting a warm glow across the hotel's facade, Shaq knew that their work wasn't over. The fight for justice, for truth, would continue, but now they had a foundation on which to build. The Crescent would never forget its past, but it would no longer be bound by it. It would be a place of remembrance, of healing, and ultimately of redemption. And in that there was hope. Shaq stood in the lobby, looking at the freshly printed posters displayed around the hotel. Each poster carried a message of hope and accountability. It was a small but powerful change, a shift in tone that had slowly become the hallmark of the Crescent's transformation. Guests who had once avoided the hotel now walked in with respect, some out of curiosity, others to pay their respects. The once maligned hotel was beginning to foster a different kind of energy, one that was quieter, more thoughtful, and oddly peaceful. The memories of the past lingered in the corners, but it was no longer a place of fear. The stories, the painful truths that had been buried, had begun to emerge into the light. And in that light, the hotel's soul was changing. Shaq thought about the moment when they had first arrived, how the hotel had felt like a sinister, suffocating beast. It had taken everything they had, courage, patience, determination, to confront its dark legacy. But now, it was a different story. People came in to learn, to reflect, and in some cases, to heal. Harold had been instrumental in organizing the hotel's new focus, ensuring that each guest understood the history of the Crescent. It wasn't about glamorizing the past, it was about teaching its lessons and preventing history from repeating itself. Guests were now given a history tour, one that took them through the real stories of the people who had once worked there, suffered there, and ultimately died there. It wasn't easy to hear, but it was necessary. Ms. Crowley had worked with the city council to ensure that a permanent memorial would be established on the hotel grounds. It wasn't just a physical marker, it was a statement. A reminder that the hotel's transformation would not be temporary, and that the lessons of the past would shape its future. Shaq had agreed to speak at the dedication ceremony, a moment that he had initially dreaded but now welcomed. He had learned something during this journey. Real change didn't come from avoiding the tough conversations, it came from confronting them head-on. The hotel was now hosting more community-driven events, partnering with local organizations to foster diversity and inclusion. The conversations around discrimination, prejudice, and accountability had been uncomfortable at times, but they were necessary. The Crescent wasn't just a hotel anymore, it was a symbol of change, a place where lessons of the past met with a commitment to a more inclusive and just future. Despite the progress, Shaq knew there was still work to be done. The process of healing was ongoing, and not everyone was ready to accept the new Crescent. There were still those who preferred the hotel's old ways, who saw the spotlight on its dark history as a threat to their own reputations. Shaq had heard whispers, seen the sideways glances. But he also saw the courage in the faces of those who were ready to make a difference. Every day, he reminded himself why they had done this, why they had pushed through the horrors of the hotel's history. It was about giving voice to the voiceless, about recognizing the pain that had been ignored for too long. But it was also about inspiring hope in those who believed change was impossible. The Crescent story was a story of transformation, one that would continue for years to come. As Shaq walked through the hotel, he saw a family of 4 checking in, the young children excited by the prospect of exploring the hotel's unique history. The parents paused to read one of the posters about the hotel's commitment to social justice, their expressions thoughtful. A few years ago, the Crescent would have been just another luxury destination, a place for the rich and powerful. But now, it was different. It was accessible, not just in terms of affordability, but in its commitment to equity, inclusion, and education. The guests weren't just staying there, they were part of the hotel's larger mission. The city had begun to take notice of the Crescent's transformation. Local leaders were acknowledging the hotel as an example of how places of privilege could turn the tide on their historical wrongdoings. The hotel had become a beacon, not of luxury, but of responsibility. And while there was still resistance from some quarters, the momentum was undeniable. Ms. Crowley joined Shaq in the lobby, her smile tired but sincere. "We've come a long way," she said quietly. "But it's still a journey. There are more people to reach, more stories to tell." Shaq nodded, his gaze fixed on the bustling lobby. "I know. But we're on the right path. We've given people a reason to believe in redemption. And that's not something you can undo." Harold appeared beside them, holding a stack of new brochures. "We've got some feedback from the first round of tours. People are moved, but they're also asking for more. They want to get involved, to contribute. It's starting to feel like a movement." Shaq looked at Harold, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. The work they had done wasn't just about changing the hotel, it was about changing the narrative. It was about turning a place that had been defined by exploitation into one that now championed equity and respect. But the real transformation, the one that would ensure lasting change, was in the minds and hearts of the people who walked through the hotel's doors. As they gathered to discuss the next phase of their work, Shaq thought about how far they had come. The Crescent was no longer just a building. It was a symbol, a reminder that redemption was possible, no matter how deep the wounds went. He didn't know what the future held for the hotel, but he knew that they had set it on a path that would make sure it would never forget the lessons it had learned. The Crescent would stand, not as a monument to the past, but as a beacon of hope for the future. As the weeks passed, Shaq felt the weight of the change they had initiated at the Crescent Hotel. The initial relief from the hotel's haunting presence had slowly given way to a growing responsibility, one he couldn't escape, even if he wanted to. The Crescent was no longer just a hotel. It had transformed into something much larger. It was a living testament to the power of redemption, of confronting uncomfortable truths and using them to shape a better future. Shaq was walking through the now quiet halls one evening, reflecting on how different the place felt. The once oppressive atmosphere had been replaced with a sense of calm, of purpose. The hotel wasn't perfect, but it was real. It had faced its demons, and in doing so, it had offered hope to others. The transformation wasn't just on the surface. It had seeped into the core of the hotel. The staff, once fearful of speaking up, now held their heads high, confident in the knowledge that they were part of something greater than themselves. Ms. Crowley had played a pivotal role in instilling that sense of pride, reminding everyone that the hotel's journey toward redemption was a shared effort. The guests were different too. There were fewer tourists looking for luxury, and more individuals seeking something deeper. Many came to hear the stories, to honor the memories of those who had suffered in the hotel's shadow. Others came out of curiosity, skeptical but open to the idea of change. And inevitably there were still those who refused to accept the new narrative, but their voices grew quieter with each passing day. Shaq knew the hotel would always carry the weight of its past, but now, it also carried a sense of accountability. The staff and the guests who chose to engage with that history were helping to rewrite the Crescent's story. And through their collective effort, the hotel had become a symbol of resilience, a place where healing was not just possible, but actively pursued. The Crescent's new mission didn't stop at awareness. It was about taking tangible actions to ensure the mistakes of the past weren't repeated. The memorial established on the grounds served not only as a tribute to those who had been wronged, but as a constant reminder of the responsibility they all shared in creating a more just future. Shaq had seen firsthand how deeply people could be impacted when given the space to reflect and learn. He had watched guests leave the hotel with a renewed sense of purpose, often moved to become advocates for social justice in their own communities. Harold, ever the strategist, had turned his attention to establishing partnerships with local organizations, ensuring that the hotel's commitment to inclusion and social responsibility extended beyond its walls. The goal wasn't just to tell the stories, it was to empower others to continue the work of change in their own lives. As for Ms. Crowley, she had become something of a spokesperson for the Crescent's transformation. Her tireless advocacy for the hotel's new vision had earned her the respect of both the local community and the broader public. She was frequently invited to speak at conferences, sharing the hotel's story as a blueprint for other businesses and institutions seeking to atone for their past and contribute to a more inclusive world. Despite the progress, Shaq knew there were still challenges ahead. The hotel's history was too complex, its wrongdoings too severe, for the healing process to ever be truly complete. There would always be scars, both on the hotel and in the hearts of those who had been affected by its past. But that didn't mean the fight was over. It was far from it. Shaq understood now that the hotel's transformation wasn't just about making amends for the sins of the past. It was about ensuring that those sins never happened again. It was about creating a space where voices could be heard, where people could feel safe and valued, no matter their background. The Crescent had become a place where the stories of the oppressed were told, where justice was not an abstract concept but an active, living force. As the sun set over the hotel, casting a warm glow across the grounds, Shaq stood at the edge of the courtyard, watching as the evening guests filtered in. He knew that each person who passed through the hotel's doors was a part of its ongoing story. It was no longer a place of darkness, but one of opportunity, a place where change was not only possible, but tangible. He thought of the people whose voices had been silenced by the hotel's history, those who had suffered so much and had been forgotten for too long. He thought of the spirits who had been freed, not just from the haunting presence of the hotel, but from the weight of history itself. The Crescent would never forget them, and neither would the people who came to honor their memory. Shaq took a deep breath, feeling a quiet pride fill his chest. The work wasn't finished, and there would always be more to do, but the Crescent had proven something fundamental, that redemption was possible. That even the darkest of places could be transformed, and in the process, so could the people who worked to change them. The Crescent's story had only just begun. It was now a place where people didn't just come to stay, it was a place they came to become part of something bigger. And in that sense, Shaq knew, the hotel had finally become what it was always meant to be, a beacon of hope, a symbol of the possibility for change, and a reminder that no matter how dark the past, the future could always be brighter. He smiled, watching the hotel come to life as night fell. It had been a long road, but it had been worth every step.